Okay, good evening, everybody. Happy Hobbit Day to you all. Thanks for joining me. This is a comparatively spontaneous event that I wanted to do here tonight because it's Hobbit Day and I wanted to get together with folks and do a Tolkien reading. So that's what we're going to do. Thanks for joining me on this day, which has been a really fun day. It's the end of a long day. I've already done 2 broadcasts already today. We had a really fun Silmarillion film project episode this morning where we finished killing off lots of people at the kinslaying at Alqualonde, which was great. And then I had my Grifflet stream where somebody else died, but that was a little sadder. But anyways, it's been a day full of mortality actually in my earlier streams. So tonight we are going to focus on more fun things. You watched the Rankin Bass Hobbit with your 5 and 3-year-old today. Wow. Richard, were they freaked out by Smaug? Because I got to tell you, I watched the Rankin Bass Hobbit with my oldest son, Nicholas, when he was probably not more than 5. He was maybe 4 or 5. And he was like terrified of Smaug. He had nightmares for like weeks after we watched the Rankin Bass. And I mean, I understand because like the whole cat-faced dragon thing kind of gives me nightmares sometimes too. But really, they found the goblins scarier than Smaug. Yeah, for some reason. I don't know what it was, but there was something about the Rankin Bass Smaug that really just kind of freaked my son out. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. It was kind of fun though, because actually for a couple years after that, that moment in The Hobbit, particularly the moment of like Bard standing out, on the piers of Lake Town, shooting his arrow up into the terrifying dragon and bringing it down, became a kind of a metaphor, right, for the between us for standing up to your fears and things like that. So it was kind of fun. It was one of my first like life application of Tolkien with my kids, so it kind of it came out well in the end, but it was still kind of terrifying. Korea, yeah, that son is allergic to cats. I don't think that's why he was afraid though, but we'll see. And I just this didn't occur to me forever. I was always extremely puzzled. I never understood why the Rankin Bass dragon looks like a cat. I mean, I've always looked at that and I'm just like, okay, there are a lot of freaky visual choices that are being made, but I couldn't understand even like what is suggesting it. Like how did they, what kind of connections in like the warped mind led to Cat Smaug. But when I was just rereading that chapter with my younger son, we got to the description of Smaug, and remember, he's like purring. It sounds like he's purring. It's compared to purring, like an enormous cat. And I was like, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? Like, did they really just sort of seize upon that one audio metaphor, right? It has nothing to do with how he looks, and turn that into a visual thing. I mean, I don't know. There's like crit fic to try to guess what was going on in Rankin Bass's mind, but that was the one. I was like, okay, all right. So there is a cat connection. There is one cat connection. Fine. Anyway, yeah. Okay. Some of you are suggesting that it has something to do with the animators being Japanese. Maybe. Not sure that excuses it to me. I'm really not. But okay. All right, yeah, and both Stephanie and Kelly think it has something to do with the Smaug pronunciation. Yeah, okay, possibly another auditory suggestion there. All right. Well, I put it up for a vote to the public on Twitter today. I nominated some of my favorite passages to read with you tonight, and Conversation with Smaug, in fact, won. So we're going to do that. but I'm gonna confess that I want to do poetry anyway. So I'm gonna do a poem too, because I want to start with a fun poem. This is not gonna be one of my we'll go through and like analyze it line by line kind of poetry things. I just want to do a poetry reading because it's fun. This is, I think, the poem that took me more by surprise than anything else I've like any poem I ever read by Tolkien. And I only read it recently because it had never been published before. So what I'm going to read you is Yumbo, or Ye Type of Oliphant. So what this is the original poem, which is going to be revised into Sam Gamgee's Oliphant poem. Okay, so when Sam does the Oliphant poem, you all know the Oliphant poem that Sam does. It is a revision of a much earlier text. Now this was known. I mean, I knew this. There are two. So Tolkien published 4 poems under the collective title, The Freaks of Physiologus, which is a great title. And the conceit of these poems is that they're fake bestiary poems. So let me just kind of give a tiny little bit of context to understanding what like, because medieval bestiaries are kind of a strange thing, right? So they're not always in verse. Sometimes they're in prose, but basically you get this sort of it's a book about animals, right? It teaches you about animals, but it teaches you about animals in an unusual kind of way, right? So you learn about the animals, and often, like, it's very often a collection. It's like it'll be like a physical description, but then it'll bring in like folk tales involving the animals, and often this is not a work of science. It was never intended to be a work of science, and not in the way that we think about, like a scientific description of animals. It's a collection of stories. Many of the things that you read in real medieval bestiaries, it's clear that no one who read these books could possibly be under any illusion that they were actually literally scientifically true. Like, for instance, there was no peasant, howsoever ill-educated in the British Isles, who would have actually labored under the belief that deer shot lightning bolts out of their butts, right? That didn't happen. Nobody thought that actually happened. They had encountered plenty of deer and escaped completely unelectrocuted from the situation. So I'm again, it's not about like, back then they believed the darndest thing about these common animals. Like, that's just not the way it worked, right? So clearly, when you're reading something like that, the conclusion that I think you really must draw is we're in a different place, right? We're the kind of reading experience we're having here is different. This is not a science textbook, right? And what is revealed by the way that we come to understand that, right? When you read the entry to the end, at the end there's a significatio. That is, it gives an interpretation. Really, the whole point of it is just it's to be allegorical, right? And it gives an allegorical message at the end. So that's all kind of fun. So that's the tradition that he was playing with, and you'll see that shape to his poem. So like I said, okay, sorry, Arthur, for a second I thought you were insisting that the deer near you actually did shoot lightning bolts out of their behinds. But anyway, so I'm glad to see. I thought, man, I was gonna have to be eating crow right there, right? But anyway, so this is sort of the thing that Tolkien is playing off of, right, in this series of poems. Now, you may be familiar with another one of the Freaks of Physiologus poems that Tolkien revised and published in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil eventually, and that's Fastetokalon, which is actually really kind of interesting because it's clearly a turtle in the revised version, but he changed it. It was originally a whale. But anyway, and he kind of denied it. Anyway, it's interesting actually to read Fastetokalon and compare it to the original. But we didn't have the original. It was like, it was not in publication. You couldn't get the original Oliphant poem. And of course, what he publishes in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil is just Sam Gamgee's Oliphant poem. It's nothing like the original. And you kind of know, like, you look at it and you know, like, this is, I really wonder what the original Oliphant poem was. So finally, Hammond and Scull, when they edited the new edition of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil several years ago, they published the original poems of both the original Fastetocalan and the original Yumbo or Ye Kind of Oliphant. And boy, it's kind of a surprise. So I will read through. Remember, this is a moral tale. It's an allegory that has an edifying moral conclusion. That's the whole point of these things. We're supposed to learn something, people. Okay. Yumbo, or ye kind of ye Oliphant. Natura Yumbonis, which of course means the nature of the jumbo, the nature of the elephant. The Indic Oliphant's a burly lump, a moving mountain, a majestic mammal, but those that fancy that he wears a hump confuse him incorrectly with the camel. His pendulous ears they flap about like flannel, he trails a supple elongated nose, that twixt his tusks of pearly white enamel performs the functions of a rubber hose, or vacuum cleaner, as his needs impose. Or on occasion serves in a trumpet's stead, whose fearful fanfares utterly surpass, in mighty music from his monstrous head, the hollow boom of bells or bands of brass. Nor do these creatures quarrel, as, alas, do neighbors musical in western lands. In congregations do they tramp the grass, and munch the juicy shoots in friendly bands, till not a leaf unmasticated stands. One of my favorite lines, till not a leaf unmasticated stands. This social soul's one unconvivial flaw has nonetheless. He's poor in repartee, his jests are heavy, for Mohammed's law he loves, and though he has the thirst of three, his vast interior he fills with tea. Not thus do water drinkers vice escape, and weighty authors state that privily he takes a drug more deadly than the grape, compared with which cocaine's a harmless jape. By the way, of course, you understand the reference to Muhammad's law. The only reference to Islam here is the prohibition of alcohol, right? So the problem with the Oliphant is that he's a teetotaler. He doesn't drink alcohol. Instead, he fills his vast interior with tea. That's his vice. The dark mandragora's unwholesome root he chews with relish secret and unholy, despising other pharmaceutic loot as terebinth, Athenes, or moly. Those diabolic juices coursing slowly do fill his sluggish veins with sudden madness, changing his grave and simple nature wholly to a lamb titanic, capering in gladness, a Brobdingnagian basilisk in badness. The vacuous spaces of his empty head are filled with fires of fell intoxication. His legs endure no longer to be led, but wander free in strange emancipation. Then frightful fear, amid his exaltation, awakes within him, lest he tumble flat. For apparatus none for levitation has he, who falling down must feebly bat the air with legs inadequate and fat. Then does he haste, if he can coax his limbs, to some deep silent water or dark pool, where no reptilian mugger lurks or swims, and there he stands, no, not his brow to cool, but thinking that he cannot fall, the fool, buoyed by his belly adipose and round. Yet if he find no water, as a rule, he blindly blunders thumping o'er the ground, and villages invades with thunderous sound. If any house oppose his brutish bump, then woe betide, it crumples in a heap, its inmates jumbled in a jellied lump, pulped unexpecting in imprudent sleep. When tired at last, as tame as any sheep or jaded nag, he longs for sweet repose, in a tree, whose roots like serpents creep, of girth gigantic, opportunely grows, whereon to lean his weary bulk and doze. Thus will his dreams not end in sudden jerk, he thinks. What hopes? For hunters all too well acquainted with his little habits, lurk beneath the upas shade, a nasty cell. For Oliphants they plan his funeral knell. With saws they well nigh sever all the bole, then cunning prop it that he may not tell, until thereto he trusts his weight, poor soul. It all gives way and lands him in a hole. Significatio. Now, let's pause for a second before the significatio. We're going to interpret this, right? Now, first of all, this story about the hunters, right? How he leans himself against a tree for rest, but is deceived by the wily hunters who have sawn almost all the way through the trunk so that when he leans upon it, it dumps him in a hole. That's a really classic kind of bestiary move, right? Because you can think, remember, you're interpreting allegorically, right? There's a moral lesson here. It seems like there's an obvious lesson to that. Right, and remember before he was chewing narcotic plants, right, and going crazy. So there's all kinds of allegorical conclusions that we could draw from this, right? So let us enjoy the edifying significatio. The doctrine that these mournful facts propound needs scarcely pointing, yet we cannot blink the fact that some still follow base Mahound, though Christian people universally think that water neat is hardly fit to drink. Not music nor fat feeding make a feast, but wine and plenty of it. Good men wink at fun and frolic, though too well policed, when mildly canned or innocently greased. But those whose frenzy's root is drugs not drink should promptly be suppressed and popped in clink. The end. So the moral of the story is anti-teetotalism, right? This just goes to show that you shouldn't be a teetotaler, right? Because so the moral of the story is that water neat is hardly fit to drink. Wine and plenty of it. That's the moral of the story. Good men wink at fun and frolic, though too well policed, when mildly canned or innocently greased. That's drinks, not drugs, Karita. That's exactly it. That is the moral of the Oliphant poem. Arthur, it is rather a different tone than we're used to, right? I mean, that's like I said, I don't know that I ever read anything that Tolkien wrote with more surprise than I read that poem for the first time. And I love the playfulness of it, not just the way that he's playing with the form and not just the way that he kind of, does this sort of really surprising reversal at the end, it sort of making fun not only of like the form, but making fun of the whole moralism of it, right? That he adopts this deeply sententious tone to advocate the use of alcohol instead of drinking water, and but of course even that is even the ponderous tone of his moralizing there at the end gets undermined by his really flippant expressions like mildly canned or innocently greased. And the way that he juxtaposes, really kind of comical imagery with, like, whenever he uses a really big word in the poem, he'll write that, his legs endure no longer to be led, but wander free in strange emancipation. Then frightful fear amid his exultation awakes within him, lest he tumble flat. For apparatus none for levitation has he, who falling down must feebly bat the air with legs inadequate and fat. Inadequate, of course, is not a super fancy word, but that has the rhythm, right, of so many of these lines. The combination of a very polysyllabic and often very obscure word with not only a very simple word like fat, but funny. And yeah, Tony, this is before the Disney Jumbo movie. Absolutely, yeah. And yes, Philip, the Brobdingnagian basilisk of badness is another wonderful example of that. Yeah. So anyhow, no, Lisa, I don't think he did draw any illustrations to accompany this. And this poem, he published this poem. I forget exactly where the Freaks of Physiologus were published. But it was one of those, many of his poetry was published in sort of relatively obscure local journals and stuff like that. in his younger days. And this was written, gosh, I'm forgetting the date exactly, but early 20s, I think. Tolkien's poetry in the 20s is hysterical. I mean, he starts off with this sort of mythic mode and writes a lot of poetry in conjunction with the Lost Tales and his Silmarillion stuff. Some of it quite serious, some of it much more, sort of lighthearted, like Goblin Feet, famously, or Tin Fang Warble, the poem which has my favorite two opening lines of any Tolkien poem. Oh the hoot, oh the hoot. Oh the hoot, oh the hoot, how he trillops on his flute. Oh the hoot, you have to admit is a pretty awesome opening line. But anyway, so some of them are fairly lighthearted, but a lot of them are really sort of his poetic contemplations of a lot of the ideas from his early concepts of not only of fairy and of the history of the elves, but of their relationship to England. You're thinking here particularly of poems like blanking on the thing. It's been a long day. Corturian Among the Trees. Corturian was the word that was escaping me. Corturian Among the Trees, which Christopher Tolkien gives in 3 versions, right in the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1. That's a kind of poem that he wrote a lot in the teens. Then in the 20s, he kind of goes wild and writes a bunch of. This is where you get the Man in the Moon poems. This is where you get the Root of the Boot, the Stone Troll poem. This is where you get, the Freaks of Physiologus, both Yumbo and Fastetokalon. There were 2 others which aren't anywhere available that I know of. The other 2, by the way, they were about an elephant and a whale, were Yumbo and Fastetokalon. And then there was one about a fox and one about, I think, a rhinoceros was the other one. So you can find this poem in print for yourself. The only place you can find this poem in print that I know of is in the edition of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which was just published, under that title. The new scholarly edition of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, published by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull just a couple years ago, 2015, 2014, something like that. 2014, yeah, I knew it was very near. Robert, I knew I could count on you for the details. And it was the Stapleton magazine in 1927, Robert, thank you, where the Freaks of Physiologus originally were released. So, yeah. And Matthew, Matt says there was something about this that reminds him of Kipling and Gunga Din. Matthew, I mean, I don't know Kipling that well, but I actually get the feeling that he's kind of tweaking Kipling directly. There were a couple places that I was kind of thinking that too in this poem. Anyway, yeah. Lisa, there is not a published collection of Tolkien's poetry. And in my opinion, this is the greatest hole in Tolkien scholarship today. For a long time, we were kind of waiting and hoping that eventually we'd get to see The Fall of Arthur, and there was these other things which had never been published, and in which we were sort of longing for and hoping to get into better circulation. Christopher has done a great job of coming out with with most of those now. So we have all of those things, but what we still don't have is a really good collected poetic works of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you want to do that, you've still got to hunt them down high and low and here and there. And that's something that really should happen. Several of you are recommending that I take up that project. There's a better scholar for this who is, I think, on this job, and I'm hoping that it is not too far in the future. There's somebody who is already moving, I think, on this project, and I hope that it will actually move along and come out. No, what I want to do is the companion commentary volume to the complete. There are many people who are much better at archival work and textual criticism than I am. Who will do a much better job of producing an excellently edited volume of Tolkien's poetry. Many people much better equipped than I to do that. But again, what I want to do, I want to do the companion volume. I want to go through and do analysis poem by poem. That is what we need to do. But anyway, someday, I certainly do hope to live to see a complete poetic works of Tolkien, because there's still some poems that I've never read before. I mean, I'd like to read the fox and the rhinoceros poems. Are you kidding me? So, Draco, I hear you. Is making fun of me for the very concept of my publishing one companion volume to such a thing. It would probably be more like the 40-volume companion to the complete poetic works of J.R.R. Tolkien. So you're right. There it is. Okay. So with that preamble, let's get to the main thing here. So, okay. We are reading Conversations with Smaug tonight. That is what the electorate chose here this afternoon. So that's going to be our primary Tolkien reading here tonight. We'll read this and we'll talk about it a little bit. So I'm gonna go back a little bit to Bilbo's second trip down the hole here. The sun was shining when he started, but it was as dark as night in the tunnel. The light from the door, almost closed, soon faded as he went down. So silent was his going that smoke on a gentle wind could hardly have surpassed it, and he was inclined to feel a bit proud of himself as he drew near the lower door. There was only the very faintest glow to be seen. Old Smaug is weary and asleep, he thought. He can't see me, and he won't hear me. Cheer up, Bilbo. He had forgotten or had never heard about dragons' sense of smell. It is also an awkward fact that they can keep half an eye open, watching while they sleep if they are suspicious. Smaug certainly looked fast asleep, almost dead and dark, with scarcely a snore more than a whiff of unseen steam, when Bilbo peeped once more from the entrance. He was just about to step out onto the floor when he caught a sudden thin and piercing ray of red from under the drooping lid of Smaug's left eye. He was only pretending to sleep. He was watching the tunnel entrance. Hurriedly, Bilbo stepped back and blessed the luck of his ring. Then Smaug spoke. "Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along. Help yourself again. There is plenty and to spare." But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. "No, thank you, O Smaug the Tremendous," he replied. "I did not come for presents. I only wished to have a look at you, and see if you were truly as great as tales say. I did not believe them." "Do you now?" said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. "Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities," replied Bilbo. "You have nice manners for a thief and a liar," said the dragon. "You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you, and where do you come from, may I ask?" "You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths have led, and through the air I am he that walks unseen." "So I can well believe," said Smaug, "but that is hardly your usual name." "I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number." "Lovely titles," sneered the dragon, "but lucky numbers don't always come off." "I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I came from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me." "These don't sound so creditable," scoffed Smaug. "I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider," went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. "That's better," said Smaug, "but don't let your imagination run away with you." This is, of course, the way to talk to dragons, if you don't want to reveal your proper name, which is wise, and don't want to infuriate them by a flat refusal, which is also very wise. No dragon can resist the fascination of riddling talk and of wasting time trying to understand it. There was a lot here which Smaug did not understand at all, though I expect you do, since you know all about Bilbo's adventures to which he was referring. But he thought he understood enough, and he chuckled in his wicked inside. I thought so last night, he smiled to himself. Lakemen, some nasty scheme of those miserable tub-trading lakemen, or I'm a lizard. I haven't been down that way for an age and an age, but I will soon alter that. Very well, O Barrel Rider, he said aloud. Maybe Barrel was your pony's name, and maybe not, though it was fat enough. You may walk unseen, but you did not walk all the way. Let me tell you I ate 6 ponies last night, and I shall catch and eat all the others before long. In return for the excellent meal, I will give you one piece of advice for your good. Don't have more to do with dwarves than you can help. Dwarves? Said Bilbo in pretended surprise. Don't talk to me, said Smaug. I know the smell and taste of dwarf, no one better. Don't tell me I can eat a dwarf-ridden pony and not know it. You'll come to a bad end if you go with such friends, thief Barrel Rider. I don't mind if you go back and tell them so from me. But he did not tell Bilbo that there was one smell that he could not make out at all, Hobbit smell. It was quite outside his experience, and puzzled him mightily. I suppose you got a fair price for that cup last night, he went on. Come now, did you? Nothing at all? Well, that's just like them. And I suppose they are skulking outside, and your job is to do all the dangerous work and get what you can when I'm not looking? For them? And you will get a fair share? Don't you believe it. If you get off alive, you will be lucky. Bilbo was now beginning to feel really uncomfortable. Whenever Smaug's roving eye, seeking for him in the shadows, flashed across him, he trembled, and an unaccountable desire seized hold of him to rush out and reveal himself and tell all the truth to Smaug. In fact, he was in grievous danger of coming under the dragon spell, but plucking up courage, he spoke again. You don't know everything, O Smaug the Mighty, said he. Not gold alone brought us hither. Ha ha, you admit the us, laughed Smaug. Why not say us 14 and be done with it, Mr. Lucky Number? I am pleased to hear that you had other business in these parts besides my gold. In that case, you may perhaps not altogether waste your time. I don't know if it has occurred to you that even if you could steal the gold bit by bit, a matter of 100 years or so, you could not get it very far. Not much use on the mountainside? Not much use in the forest? Bless me, had you never thought of the catch? A 14th share, I suppose, or something like it? Those were the terms, eh? But what about delivery? What about cartage? What about armed guards and tolls? And Smaug laughed aloud. He had a wicked and a wily heart, and he knew his guesses were not far out, though he suspected the lakemen were at the back of the plans, and that most of the plunder was meant to stop there in the town by the shore, that in his young days had been called Esgaroth. You will hardly believe it, but poor Bilbo was really very taken aback. So far all his thoughts and energies had been concentrated on getting to the mountain and finding the entrance. He had never bothered to wonder how the treasure was to be removed. Certainly never how any part of it that might fall to his share was to be brought back all the way to Bag End, Underhill. Now a nasty suspicion began to grow in his mind. Had the dwarves forgotten this important point too, or were they laughing in their sleeves at him all the time? That is the effect that dragon talk has on the inexperienced. Bilbo, of course, ought to have been on his guard, but Smaug had rather an overwhelming personality. I tell you, he said, in an effort to remain loyal to his friends and to keep his end up, that gold was only an afterthought with us. We came over hill and under hill, by wave and wind, for revenge. Surely, O Smaug the unaccessibly wealthy, you must realize that your success has made you some bitter enemies? Then Smaug really did laugh, a devastating sound, which shook Bilbo to the floor, while far up in the tunnel the dwarves huddled together and imagined that the hobbit had come to a sudden and a nasty end. Revenge, he snorted, and the light of his eyes lit the hall from floor to ceiling like scarlet lightning. Revenge! The king under the mountain is dead, and where are his kin that dare seek revenge? Girion, Lord of Dale, is dead, and I have eaten his people like a wolf among sheep, and where are his sons that dare approach me? I kill where I wish, and none dare resist. I laid low the warriors of old, and their like is not in the world today. Then I was but young and tender. Now I am grown old and strong, strong, thief in the shadows, he gloated. My armor is like tenfold shields, my teeth are swords, my claws spears, the shock of my tail a thunderbolt, my wings a hurricane, and my breath death." "I have always understood," said Bilbo in a frightened squeak, "that dragons were softer underneath, especially in the region of the, chest. But doubtless one so fortified has thought of that." The dragon stopped short in his boasting. "Your information is antiquated," he snapped. "I am armored above and below, with iron scales and hard gems. No blade can pierce me." "I might have guessed it," said Bilbo. "Truly there can be nowhere found the equal of Lord Smaug the Impenetrable. What magnificence to possess a waistcoat of fine diamonds!" "Yes, it is rare and wonderful indeed," said Smaug, absurdly pleased. He did not know that the Hobbit had previously caught a glimpse of his peculiar undercovering on his previous visit, and was itching for a closer view for reasons of his own. The dragon rolled over. "Look," he said, "what do you say to that?" "Dazzlingly marvelous! Perfect! Flawless! Staggering!" exclaimed Bilbo aloud, but what he thought inside was, "Old fool! Why, there is a large patch in the hollow of his left breast, as bare as a snail out of its shell." After he had seen that, Mr. Baggins's one idea was to get away. "Well, I really must not detain your magnificence any longer," he said, "or keep you from much-needed rest. Ponies take some catching, I believe, after a long start. And so do burglars," he added as a parting shot, as he darted back and fled up the tunnel. It was an unfortunate remark, for the dragon spouted terrific flames after him, and fast though he sped up the slope, he had not gone nearly far enough to be comfortable before the ghastly head of Smaug was thrust against the opening behind. Luckily, the whole head and jaws could not squeeze in, but the nostrils sent forth fire and vapor to pursue him, and he was nearly overcome, and stumbled blindly on in great pain and fear. He had been feeling rather pleased with the cleverness of his conversation with Smaug, but his mistake at the end shook him into better sense. "Never laugh at live dragons, Bilbo, you fool," he said to himself, and it became a favorite saying of his later, and passed into a proverb. "You aren't nearly through this adventure yet," he added, and that was pretty true as well. Okay. Observations. What do you notice? What things strike you as you're as you listen to this passage? A bunch of things that that I was thinking of going back through. First of all, that one thing that I'd never noticed for a long time, never really thought about for a long time, how conspicuous is the simile that Bilbo uses to himself when he's looking at the bare patch in the hollow of the left breast of Smaug, when he says that it is there's a patch in the hollow of his left breast that is as bare as a snail out of its shell. And of course, we just saw snails being gotten out of their shells, right, by the thrush. The knocking of the thrush, which was the sign given, right, in the prophetic moon letter inscription on the map, was in fact a snail being got out of its shell. So what this what that simile does, right, is, and of course the thrush who is doing that to the snails is the one who is the instrument to bear that word to Bard and leads to the death of the dragon. So I love the way that one little simile transforms that whole scene, right? I mean, as we can already see when we read the text of the moon letters carefully, the text of the moon letters are not instructions on how to open the door, or if they are, they're the most wildly impractical instructions, right, that have ever been given. Instead, it's a prophecy. Right. It says, stand here at this point, and when that happens, these other things will just occur. Don't, and not like, and then do that. Right. But rather, just stand there and it will be revealed. Again, it's a prediction. It's a prophecy. It's not instructions. And in retrospect, we can see that those instructions foreshadow the death of the dragon himself, right? So, the getting rid of Smaug was always a weak point in their plans, right? But it turns out that indeed the side door is the key. Not in any way that they, that sort of seems obvious. They still, after they get through the door, still have no idea what to do, right? And one of my favorite lines in the book is how, Bilbo always felt rather inclined to point out that getting rid of the dragon had always been rather a weak point in their plans, right? And yet again, we can see from this that the death of Smaug is implied indirectly, and in a sense, kind of unexpectedly, in that prophecy of the thrush knocking the snails upon the stone, which is really cool. Yeah, Lee, I always like the flattery as well. O Smaug, the unaccessibly wealthy, is very good, right? And you're right, it's very good as flattery, right? Not just a cool phrase, but it is really good, right? That he's implying, as Lee points out, both that his wealth is too much to count, and that, Smaug himself is unaccessible, right? He is beyond the scope of, mortal imagination. He is greater and more powerful than anyone can contemplate. Arthur, great question. Is there a tie between the dragon spell and the dragon sickness? I was actually thinking about that too as I was reading that passage. They're obviously not the same thing exactly, but when we look at it, there's certainly some interesting kinds of similarities, right? Now, on the one hand, although there's a similarity, right, both of them are hyphenated phrases with the word dragon in the front, right? But even apart from that basic similarity, what is the dragon spell, right? The dragon spell, as we can see if we go back to that passage here. In fact, he was in grievous danger of coming under the dragon spell, which is what, in the previous sentence, we're told, an unaccountable desire seized hold of him to rush out and reveal himself and tell all the truth to Smaug. That is what the dragon spell is trying to get him to do. In fact, you see what instrument Smaug is using to exert his will over Bilbo's will, and to try to manipulate Bilbo's will into submitting to him. Exactly, Tony, you've got it. It's a worm tongue, right? That's a worm tongue in action, right? Worm is a dragon. The spell, dragon spell, worm tongue and dragon spell, they're not exactly synonyms, but they're almost synonyms. They're talking about the same thing. The tongue of a worm is able to cast a spell and to enthrall the wills of others. And so here we have Smaug wants him to come out and reveal himself, right? That's what Smaug is attempting to do. So we have the will of Smaug attempting to dominate Bilbo's will. That's the spell, right, that he is attempting to cast on him. Now, Zachary, you're right that his eye is important, right? The beam of his eye that's going around in that very sort of Tolkienian thing, right, of the luminous eyes, the eyes that actually shoot out beams of light. We see Gollum has eyes that shoot out beams of light that don't just seem to glow in the dark, actually radiate in the dark, such that Bilbo, remember, can see the tunnel illuminated in front of Gollum from behind, right? When Bilbo is standing behind Gollum, he can see the light of his eyes is illuminating the tunnel so that Bilbo can see by it, right? It's very clear that many of these Tolkienian characters have literally radiant eyes, right? And Smaug is clearly one. And so I certainly do agree, Zachary, that in the eyes of the dragon, we can see it seems to be a kind of like a physical representation of his own will, right? Of his bringing his own will to bear. His words are the instruments of his will, but yes, the sort of the roving spotlight of Smaug's attention does show, and it does suggest if Bilbo weren't concealed, right, not only would Smaug likely kill him where he stands, but he'd be able to transfix him with his eye. And remember, that's just what happened to Turin, right? We've got precedents for that. So we do definitely see that. Richard says that Grendel did it before it was cool. The luminous eye thing, Richard, I assume you're talking about? Yeah, exactly. Tolkien didn't get that from nowhere. Yeah, good. You're right, Kate, that it is interesting that a liar has the power to draw out the truth, right? To compel others to speak the truth to him. There is a kind of irony there. Especially because there's a kind of like quasi-confessional moment there, right? Like that desire to run out and reveal himself and tell all the truth to Smaug. It's a kind of a parody of that, like to come clean and be upfront, right, and tell the truth. These are all good things, aren't they? Whereas like holding back, concealing yourself, and being devious doesn't seem like the right thing to do. And yet, obviously, in this case, it's exactly what the dragon is trying to trap you into doing. Yet good. A couple others are and yet Marianne, that's really good. Marianne points to, of course, how it's not only the bad guys who have luminous eyes. The eyes of the Noldor are described as shining and glinting and things like that in the Silmarillion. So that certainly seems to be a thing there. Yep. And yet, for those of you who are following me on Twitch here, I can see your chat there, so that's all good. Don't worry about that. Good. And Guibrella, if you're on GoToWebinar, yes, other people can't see. It's just, those are just messages to me. That's actually what I love about GoToWebinar chat. Those are just questions that come straight to me. Yeah, good. Excellent. Stephanie, you're right. Stephanie points out that Smaug, of course, isn't written as a simple, evil, fire-breathing dragon. Tolkien fascinatingly makes him more cunning and very well-spoken than what most would expect from literary dragons. Yes, he's bad, but notice when Smaug is being... notice the most extreme criticism that Smaug receives from the narrator, right? When he is openly described as being wicked, right? It's when he's being devious, right? It's when he is being misleading to Bilbo and trying to get him to doubt the dwarves, trying to create dissension between Bilbo and the dwarves. That's when we're told that he has a wicked and a wily heart, right? That's the thing that's condemned. Not, for instance, his like wholesale slaughter of people in the countryside. So I agree. I think that's really interesting. The sort of politeness of Bilbo and the dragon and I love the sort of the shades of tone there, right? How you have in some places Bilbo kind of stammering and clearly sort of freaked out, but he performs pretty well despite being freaked out. We can see sort of the pluckiness that he has, and not just his pluck, not just his courage, right? It's not only Bilbo's character that is on display. But I think back to chapter 1, right? How the narrator tells us that he's not so prosy as he likes to believe. Nowhere do we see that more clearly, even when he's making up poetry, like his spider aggravation poems or something like that, in a very awkward moment. But here, I think, is where we can see it even more than anywhere else, right? How he's not planned for this. This is completely spontaneous. He was hoping to catch Smaug napping, and he had no plans to have a conversation with him, hadn't thought about it, hadn't planned it out, and was even sort of preening himself on his ability to catch the dragon napping. So he was kind of doubly caught out in a sense. That is, caught out in the sense that he was hoping not to meet up with Smaug, but to catch him asleep, and then caught out again because he had just been feeling super confident that he had succeeded, and it's only then that Smaug turns things around. So you're right, Marianne. He does show himself to be of more than average intelligence, and I agree. I think that's a really important thing. But it's more than just brains. It's not just courage, and it's not just brains. It's that too. It's Bilbo knows how to speak to dragons, right? He's read the right sort of books. This is why I make that connection back to chapter 1 and him not being as prosy as he liked to believe, right? He knows how to behave in this kind of situation. And even when he is caught on the hop, even when he is making stuff up, he knows the kind of thing. He knows how it's supposed to work. He knows what he's supposed to do, and he does it really well. And that's really interesting, I think. So what was the other thing I was just going to talk about? Josiah, that is really interesting. Josiah is thinking about the wickedness of Smaug's heart that's condemned there, right? And Josiah says it's sort of part and parcel of the overall pattern of Tolkien playing down the adult wickedness, such as eating a whole village full of people, thinking, Josiah, of the trolls, I assume you're thinking of there, right? And playing up the wickedness that a child can relate to, such as bad manners and lying. And wiping your mouth on your sleeve, right? Like the trolls do. I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, right? Now, with Smaug, it's not quite the same. I agree that it does fit the same overall pattern, Josiah, but the thing that really interests me there is the differences as well as the similarities to that. Again, I absolutely agree with you. There is what, in some sense, in the abstract, might seem like a puzzling kind of choice to downplay the significance of, like, I ate all the dwarves and I destroyed all the warriors. And I mean, he makes some pretty horrific claims about the number of people he's killed and eaten, right? But that's not what the narrator focuses in on. And so again, you're right. It falls into that same pattern. And yet we're not invited to laugh at it in the same way, right? I mean, I argue in my book that the trolls, when we're invited, the way in which we're invited to laugh at the trolls, the places in which we're invited to laugh at the trolls, seem to create a situation essentially where where Tolkien's able to kind of have his cake and eat it too, right? On the one hand, he can depict really scary creatures, right? Like these trolls who just ate a village and a half between them, right? I mean, they're legitimately terrifying theoretically, right? And yet he can do that without it being simply overwhelmingly horrifying, right? He makes light of it without simply turning them into pure comic relief, in a sense, you know? That is, again, they're not just clowns, though, you know, we do get a lot of slapstick and clowning with them. But again, notice that's what we don't get with Smaug. Think of the condemnation, right? Old fool, right? As Bilbo sort of sees through him, and we see his pride and his arrogance and his own blindness as he boasts about the impenetrability, which Bilbo, of course, sardonically points to, of his underbelly, while revealing the fact that he has a bare patch in the hollow of his left breast. So he too makes a fool of himself, right? He too is guilty of being a fool. And we see that as he builds himself, you know, that like this great and terrifying, creature is sort of, you know, in the end, we kind of see through him in a sense in the way that Bilbo does. But the tone is very different. The tone never shifts like that. And even Josiah, though, again, I agree with you that we can see that similar pattern. There's no clear sense of what. There's no clear sense of how. There's no sense of that shift in tone, right? Of us in being invited to merely find Smaug funny. Even Bilbo's condemnation and even the old fool passage is still, in a sense, it kind of elevates Bilbo, right? Not only has he remained cool under pressure, not only is he applying all of those stories that he never took very seriously and didn't like to think about adventures before, not only is he being brave and intelligent and loyal, Lisa, as you pointed out, and sticking by his friends, even when he's feeling uncertain, we see his own confidence, right? His own condemnation of Smaug. That old fool line is in its way the most impressive sort of testament to Bilbo's character and to Bilbo's presence of mind, really. Good. Neat. But yes, Lisa, as you say, the dragon is very serious business and remains very serious business. We're never invited to laugh at him in the same way, anything really, I think, like the way that we are with the trolls. So again, Josiah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that we can see Tolkien doing the same things, and yet we can also see how things have changed, right? When we get to chapter 12, we're not in the same place that we were in chapter 3. And by the time we get to chapter 15, right, and we're by the time we get to the Battle of Five Armies, we're going to be in a different place, as we're working towards the Battle of Five Armies. And then ultimately, of course, in chapter 17, when we're going to see, vampire bats affixing themselves upon the bodies of the stricken on the field, we're going to be in a different place again, right? And it's not going to be funny at all when we get there. Yeah, good. Yes, Josiah, I agree. He's a different kind of fool than the trolls are. Absolutely. And good, Richard. That's a great way of saying it. Richard points out that we see Bilbo rising to the epicness of the occasion rather than Smaug being lowered, right? Which does happen with the trolls, and even the goblins. I think, but not with and the spiders, right? Think of the flabby football, right? That the spiders are compared to. So yeah, it's we don't get. He might be an old fool, but he's not like a flabby football. Yeah, good. Excellent. Yeah, Richard, I wasn't going to make any reference to the New England Patriots when I talked about that. Yeah, good. Michelle asks, would I say that Tolkien intended to portray Smaug as being guilty of hubris in the way that he shows his belly and brags about his scales while showing his weakness unawares? Yes. I'm always a little leery using the word hubris. There's a long tradition in literary criticism of using Greek terms kind of carelessly, right? I mean, hubris, the concept of hubris is a really interesting one, but it's the word is often kind of misapplied, or it's not really kind of exactly what the word hubris meant, kind of like the way that people even worse, take out of totally out of context, like what Aristotle said about the hamartia, which is generally interpreted as the tragic flaw, right, and make it into that really, really silly and simple-minded sort of formula, which, sadly, in my own personal experience, too many high school teachers still employ, of saying that, like, the formula in a tragedy, right, is that the hero has some tragic flaw that makes that makes the tragic hero be tragic, right? That brings about the tragedy. No good tragedy is that simple, and Aristotle wasn't saying that. But anyway, yeah. But my point, Michelle, is simply that, nevertheless, I agree with what you're saying. He is overconfident. He is arrogant. He is proud. Arrogance is a word that's used of him in the text, right? And you look at how he talks about himself. Think about what I was just saying about Bilbo being not as prosy as he likes to think. There is a sense in which Smaug is over-poetic, right? When he thinks of himself, his whole "my armor is like" speech, right? When he compares himself, he has this very grandiose self-image, right? And notice what he was just saying before that. The warriors of old are like, I laid low the warriors of old, and their like is not in the world today. Notice that this particular species of arrogance that underlies that statement, right? On the one hand, Smaug is perfectly well aware of what seems to be a general truth in Tolkien's worlds, right? And here Tolkien is following the medieval tradition, which says that things are getting worse over time, right? The sort of the myth of the modern myth, the modern belief is that it's progress, right? Things are getting better over time. Sort of the post-evolutionary myth is the myth of progress, that everything is improving and getting better. In the Middle Ages, the myth was entirely the opposite, right? The dominant cultural myth was of one of decline. Back in the old days, people used to be used to be greater. And you can see it's not just a medieval thing. You can see it even in Homer himself, right? Like, so the Homer writing, when he was writing thousands of years ago, was still saying things like, so Ajax will pick up a boulder to chuck it at somebody, and Homer will say, no two men as men are today could lift that boulder. But Ajax, he picked it up and, hucked it, way across the field at that other guy. That's what they believed. That's what the medievals continued to believe. Like, nobody can possibly compete with the great thinkers and wise people. That's why they revered Plato and Aristotle and especially Socrates, because like nobody's that smart anymore. They don't make them like that anymore, right? Everything is kind of getting lesser and decreasing over time. We see that throughout Middle-earth. Think about the number of times we see that kind of thing, how back in the old days, things are greater, bigger, stronger, and things diminish and fade over time, right? Not just, elves, as Galadriel says, I shall diminish and pass into the west. But even, like men, like think of the Númenóreans, right? Aragorn is like Isildur and Elendil, but he's not the same, right? He's shorter than Elendil was. Elendil, the first Númenórean king of the realms in exile, is also uncoincidentally the tallest of all the Númenóreans. There's never going to be anybody as tall as Elendil gets. Even in physical stature, nobody's going to compare to that. So we can see that trend. Smaug knows it, right? Smaug knows that this is how the world works, and so he's all proud of himself. He's like, okay, so the warriors, there are none like them nowadays, right? So they don't even make warriors as good as they used to make them, and I beat the ancient warriors. Right. And so now today's warriors are lower grade compared to the old warriors. Right. Oh, but wait, there's more. Right. I was only young and tender then. I was just a little dragon pup when I came. As I've been aging, I've been growing stronger and larger and better. Right. So I was small and weak back then, and yet I beat the ancient warriors. Now the warriors have gotten worse and I've gotten stronger. But you see wherein the arrogance and the pride lies, right? As Smaug has convinced himself that he alone is the exception to the rule, right? Everybody else is getting lesser and weaker over time, except him. He's getting stronger and better, right? And it's funny. Permit me a small digression that I know may not mean much to some of you, but I know there are some Dungeons and Dragons players among you. And one of the things that always amused me when I was in high school playing Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, I was, reading the monster manual, and I was like, a lot of this stuff sounds really like eerily familiar from somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where. It's funny because in the Dungeons and Dragons world, like in the monster manual, if you look up dragons in the Dungeons and Dragons monster manual, what you will see is that dragons, when they're young, are small and tender, right? But they grow bigger and stronger and more powerful as they age. That whole concept, which is a central concept, it's a really important sort of foundational concept of one of the key, Dungeons and Dragons, right? They're in the name of the game. It's based on a misreading of this passage in The Hobbit. Gary Gygax cribbed so much from Tolkien quite unashamedly, and he he misread this passage. Smaug talks like that. As time has gone on, I have grown greater and wiser and harder to beat. But he hasn't, right? He's fooling. He is an old fool, right? He is both a fool and an old fool. Right, as he's grown ancient and stronger as he thinks, he's just become an old fool. And of course, in the end, as you point out, Tony, one of those warriors of Esgaroth, who may very well be lesser than the great warriors of old, is going to take him down with one arrow. Right. So he sort of has his eyes closed to the world around him. Not exactly, but turned inwards, right? Again, Smaug is too poetic. He's looking at himself and thinking how rare and wonderful not only it is to have a diamond waistcoat, right, but to be him, right? Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, Richard, exactly. So do try that on your Dungeon Master next time when you meet the ancient Draco-Lich and explain that it actually should be much easier to kill than the young one. That might work out. You should try it. It's worth a shot anyway. Probably your most practical approach, actually, for fighting an ancient Draco-Lich, but that's okay. Yeah. And Matthew, that's a really good point. Matt's thinking about, thinking back to the Homer connection again. Matt points out that Smaug is sort of prepping for an Achilles, right? But what he gets is an Odysseus instead. And I do think that it's an interesting comparison. If you look at, go back and read Odysseus in the cave of the Cyclops, right? And how Odysseus handles himself in the cave of the Cyclops. It's a really interesting comparison. The conversation between Odysseus and Polyphemus compared to the conversation between Bilbo and Smaug. And it's not like that observation has ever been made before. But you don't see people talking about that much. I think that the Beowulf connection is like the really shiny object, right? The parallel to the moment in Beowulf where the thief sneaks in and steals the golden cup from the dragon's hoard and riles up the dragon so that he goes and sacks the town. That parallel is so enticing, right? And of course, people like Tom Shippey, of course, have done such great readings of that. I love that reading, which sort of it's such a suggestive and wonderful idea, right? That Tolkien is one of the things that's kind of going on in the background in this scene is Tolkien kind of literally filling in the hole, right? Because of course, if you know Beowulf, that's the place. Like there's actually a hole burned in the manuscript in the passage describing this, and so there's a lot that's really unclear about what's going on in that scene. So here's Tolkien kind of doing a new version, right? And literally filling in the hole in the Beowulf manuscript. Again, all that stuff is really, it's right there, right? And it's really attractive. And I'm not trying to dismiss or discount that stuff in any way. But there is the Odysseus connection, right? And I think that kind of should get more play because in a lot of ways, there's sort of more to talk about there. We get a direct parallel. We get a direct comparison, right? We can see, we can see the thief in the shadows, right? That's what Odysseus is. He's a thief in the shadows, speaking from the shadows where he is unseen by his monstrous enemy within his monstrous enemy's lair, right? I mean, so there's the parallels there are actually really closer and really interesting, right? So a comparison and contrast there, I think, is something that could bear a lot of really interesting fruit there. And good point. Matt adds, of course, Odysseus is a bowman, right? He establishes his true identity by one mighty shot with his bow, right? And so again, we can see that the way that Odysseus serves as sort of the parallel both for Bilbo in this moment and for Bard later on, as Bard, of course, is revealed as the heir of Girion by his one mighty shot. And of course, what is accomplished when Odysseus makes his one mighty shot and reveals who he is? The reestablishment of his rights over his home, right? His inheritance, right? He sort of reclaims that which has been taken from him, and he destroys those that have been gathering his treasure in one place and wasting it and holding it unlawfully, right? He goes back to seek the pale enchanted gold and his wife, and there are lots of parallels. I mean, the more you think about it, the better it works. I think it's really interesting. So, and yet, Tony, I also hated the adaptation of Bard's shot in the film. I didn't like that at all. Okay, no, that's not quite fair. There's a part of me that kind of liked what was liked the vague concept of what's going on with the sun and the involvement of the sun. I was kind of interested in that. But how it came off was, and this is like the Hobbit films in a nutshell, right? That is to say, like, intriguing kind of concept, horrible execution. But even the Tony, the mere fact that the black arrow becomes this huge ballista bolt, right? It's way too prosy, right? You can't speak to your arrow, under situations like that. Yeah. Anyway, good. Yeah, excellent. Okay. One other thing that I wanted to mention, because again, it was something else I was thinking about as I was reading through another topic that we haven't talked about, is the dwarves, right? And Smaug's accusations against the dwarves. And the thing, and some of you will have heard me talk about this before, this has been one of the things that really struck me in our readings of The Shaping of Middle-earth and The Lost Road, volumes 4 and 5 of the history of Middle-earth in our Mythgard Academy classes over the last couple years. Seeing Tolkien's initial depiction of the dwarves, and especially there, the dwarves come in the Book of Lost Tales, so it's not the first time he invents dwarves. But when we see them come in the 1930 Quentin Older-Inwa and in the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion, when Tolkien is really beginning to sort of flesh these things out right before writing The Lord of the Rings, and most importantly, right at the same time he is writing The Hobbit. That's what was so interesting in reading about this in The Shaping of Middle-earth, because when you read the Quentin Older-Inwa, so the longer version of the Silmarillion drafts that we get in Volume 4, The Shaping of Middle-earth, the thing to keep... So this you can do. You don't have to read the whole thing. Go to The Shaping of Middle-earth, go to the index, look up dwarves, right? Find the places where he's telling the story about how the elves met the dwarves, and he's describing what the dwarves are like and where they come from, right? And if you do that in The Shaping of Middle-earth, in the Quentin Older-Inwa, remember, this is written at the same time he is writing The Hobbit, right? That Thorin Oakenshield and those other dwarves, like, that is the model he has in mind. So when Thorin and the rest of them show up on Bilbo's doorstep, it is really easy for us reading The Hobbit, especially reading The Hobbit as we so often do, right? I mean, often unconsciously even, we read The Hobbit from a Lord of the Rings standpoint. That is, we're coming from the Lord of the Rings, having established our framework there, and we project that back onto The Hobbit. And of course, Tolkien encourages us to do that in the way that he has sort of retconned the whole story. But if we don't do that, right? If we resist that and think, and when we meet Balin and Dwalin and Fili and Kili and then all the rest of the dwarves in chapter 1 of The Hobbit, if when we meet them, we're thinking not of the dwarves as they're described in Appendix A of The Return of the King, right? Not the Durin's folk dwarves or anything to do with Gimli, son of Glóin. If instead, when we read The Hobbit, we are thinking only of what he has already said about dwarves in the Quentin Older-Inwa. If we look at what his dwarf concept was at that point, it's fast because it works. And the thing is, Smaug is right. Smaug is right. That is what dwarves are like. It makes the effect of it, honestly, is that it makes the repentance of Thorin 10 times as poignant, right? Because the fact is, it's not, if we read The Hobbit from that Lord of the Rings perspective, Thorin's story is like this, right? He starts off great and noble. He is the great Thorin Oakenshield, right? But then he falls into, sort of pride and desperation, and he sinks, comes under the influence of the dragon sickness, but then he's redeemed. Right. Redeemed when he charges out, even though his charge isn't effective, right? He doesn't win the battle, but still his charge out to rally everybody, including the elves and men behind him. And then, of course, in his wonderful deathbed speech to Bilbo, he's redeemed, right? And so he is once again the noble dwarf that we saw that he was at the beginning. But that's only from a post-Lord of the Rings standpoint. If we read it from a 1930 Quentin Older-Inwa perspective, what we see, he is not noble at the beginning. In fact, and you can see this is actually fairly consistent. He's full of himself, right? He is a tremendously important dwarf, especially in his own mind, right? Who considers himself too important to help out in the kitchen, right? And is full and is very quick to look down his nose and scoff at Bilbo and be impatient with Gandalf, right? He's pretentious. Has courage. Right? Especially we see that with the trolls when he stands out, even, his delivery of the line, who is knocking my people about, the way that he kind of confronts the trolls instead of just trying to sneak up on them. Though he'd be more impressive still if he had his own weapons, which he obviously doesn't have. He's unarmed. He has gone unarmed on this journey. Remember, Thorin has to pick up sticks out of the fire and beat the trolls with pointed sticks that he has pulled out of the fire. He wouldn't have to do that if he had his own weapons with him, but he doesn't seem to, in fact. Anyway, so, okay. In other words, the shape of Thorin's story, again, if we look at it from the Quentin Older-Inwa perspective, it's not a fall and then a redemption. It's an ascent. He comes to a place at the end that no dwarf has ever been before, right? It's not a redemption. It's like a conversion, actually. And his eyes are open, not reopened, right? This is not a reprioritizing of him, but his eyes open so when he talks to Bilbo about saying, if more people, valued food and, song and food and cheer above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. This is not, again, Thorin reestablishes his priorities. No, this is the light shines in for the first time. And he says, wow, because the value for hoarded gold, that's the way dwarves look at things. That's what they value. In the Quentin Older-Inwa, the dwarves aren't even primarily craftsmen. They're primarily merchants. What they value is gold. What they value is profit. The dwarves, bear with me, and I know that for some of you this will be a good comparison, and for others that won't. The dwarves in the 1930 Quenta Silmarillion are not excellent craftsmen. They're more like Ferengi from Deep Space Nine, frankly. That is much more like what we see from the dwarves. They're arms dealers who are cheerfully dealing arms to both sides. They love the war between the elves and Morgoth because they're able to deal arms to both sides, right? They're lining their own pockets. Yeah. And so Richard, I agree. Richard Albert there. I agree. That line, Thorin's line about, to Bilbo, that the famous line that everybody loves very justly so much. I think it's, to many people, it's a real wrench to think about dwarves in the much kind of lower way when we come from the 1930 Quenta Older-Inwa perspective. It's hard because there are lots of people who love dwarves, who love Gimli and who love, the concept of the dwarves as they're depicted in the Appendix A on Durin's folk in The Return of the King. So to let that go and think about dwarves as these, kind of base, totally unheroic folk who have a very strong idea of the value of money, right? That's what they care about. Remember, that's in the law. It's in the Hobbit. That's there. He tells us, he's describing that Ferengi nature of the dwarves, right? Torlonial. They don't have any rules of acquisition, but you kind of wonder if actually they do have rules of acquisition in Khuzdul. They just don't share them, right? Unlike Ferengi, they don't go around reciting them in public, but just only to each other in secret. I could totally believe that. Anyway, so Sikwayetzka on Twitch is making a joke about how the dwarves are longing to get their gold plus latinum back from Smaug. But think about that for a second. Those of you who again know the Ferengi from Deep Space Nine, think about the reverence, think about the solemnity with which the Ferengi look at Latinum, right? It's quite similar to how the dwarves talk about their gold. Remember in chapter 1 of The Hobbit, do any of them ever suggest that what they want to do is reclaim their kingdom, is reclaim their homes? It's all about the gold. It's all about the Latinum, right? That's what they care about. To seek our pale enchanted gold. They want to bring their curses home to Smaug for taking their stuff, right? Yeah. Draco, yeah, that's great. Quoting the two of my favorite laws of acquisition, or rules of acquisition. War is good for business and peace is good for business, right? Yeah, that's exactly how the dwarves in the 1930 Quenta Noldorinwa were. Anyway, yeah, Sharon says, she's wondered about parallels between Thorin and Meme. That is a really, especially again, when you go back and you take the chronological slice of things, right? Look at the 1930, give or take a couple years, right? Look at the dwarves as we get them. Dwarves as they are alluded to in the Lay of Lathian, which was just before that time. Look at the dwarves as we get them in the Quenta Noldorinwa. Look at the dwarves as we get them in the Hobbit, right? And what we see, Meme is still a huge character. In the early stuff, Meme is basically Durin. Meme is the first dwarf. He is the father of all dwarves. He is the aboriginal dwarf is Meme. So Meme is not this like outcast, low life dwarf with social issues, right? He is like the quintessential dwarf, which is why his curse is so powerful and ends up bringing down Doriath, essentially, practically single-handedly. Karita, exploitation begins in the home is a pretty good rule of acquisition too. But again, think about that particular Ferengi rule of acquisition when Smaug is talking to Bilbo, right? About how Bilbo's been taken, how Bilbo's been exploited, right? Again, I think there's something there, right? So, okay, look at all the ideas for really great paper topics, right? So I want to hear papers at MythMoot, right? Or future regional moots on these. We've got lots of material here, right? I want a close and interesting comparison of Odysseus and Bilbo, right? I want a close comparison of Ferengi and the dwarves of the Quenta Noldorinwa, right? Come on, let's make this happen, people. Good. Arthur brings up, and this is a really good point, the connection between dwarves and Jews. I've never been quite sure what to do with it. As Arthur says, okay, one, Tolkien suggests in a letter that Khuzdul is based on Hebrew. Two, that dwarves in The Hobbit look like some of the uglier stereotypes of Jews. And I would add that in the Quenta Noldorinwa as well, we can see some similarities between the depiction of dwarves and some, as you say, Arthur, some of the uglier stereotypes, especially older stereotypes of Jews. I like like Shylock vintage stereotypes of Jews. What do we do with that? To what extent is that what was in Tolkien's mind? I think it's easy to exaggerate there, I think. First off, remember, Arthur, where you started with that is, I think, the really important thing, right? On the one hand, it starts with language. It always starts with language with Tolkien. And I think that okay. Yeah, here's how I want to say that. A problem that I won't speak for absolutely everyone, but I feel comfortable in speaking of for most people in saying that most of us don't think like Tolkien did, right? It was many years before I really believed Tolkien was speaking literally when he said that his stories were primarily linguistic in inspiration, right? And were, devised to give the proper, the necessary background of history for Elvish tongues. For a long time, when I was younger, I actively disbelieved that. Not in the sense that I'm like, oh, Tolkien's full of it and he's lying there, but I was just like, he can't mean that exactly literally, right? I mean, I'm like, okay, so like, I get it. I get it, Tolkien. You mean like the languages are really important and they mean a lot to you. Like, okay, right, exactly. But surely the stories came first, right? I mean, come on. Obviously, the stories came first. No, he means quite literally what he says. The languages come first, and the languages themselves and the relationship among the languages suggest the stories. And I don't think I ever saw this really, really clearly. And began to build a kind of intuitive understanding of that relationship for Tolkien until I read the Hlamas when we did I'm forgetting. Is it in The Lost Road, The Shaping of Middle-earth? It's in The Shaping of Middle-earth, isn't it? I think it is. Correct me if I'm wrong. I forget which volume it's in, and they're on the other side of the room, so I can't reach them. Lost Road, Richard, thank you. So in the Hlamas is the history of tongues. Of course, because it's when he's preparing the Silmarillion for publication. Yeah, Lost Road. It's the philological account of the relationship of the different Elvish languages and how they develop and change. And when you read that, you can see the stories emerging from there. It was like, so studying that for the first time was the first time I ever, and it really wasn't until we did the Lost Road discussion, I think, in the Mythgard Academy, when I really read that whole book and read all of the stuff, cover to cover, that I really began to come to a better intuitive understanding of that, because it's so alien to the way that I think. I'm coming back around, Arthur, to the question about the Jews, though, because again, most people don't think like that, right? So when you take those two things, Arthur, right? A, he says that that Khuzdul, the Dwarvish language, is inspired by Semitic languages such as Hebrew, right? And B, that there are, we get some of those crossovers. And in interviews, he talked about it sometimes. We know that the connection between dwarves and the Jews is not totally out there. Like, there are some ways in which that was in the back of his mind. He admitted as much. He said that. Okay, so the problem, I think, comes in with the fact that we don't think like he thinks. So we switch it around, right? We tend to think like, okay, so what this means is, when Tolkien was inventing dwarves, he was thinking of Jews. So basically the dwarves are modeled after stereotypes of Jews, which then in turn suggests that this is what Tolkien really thought about Jews or something like that, right? I mean, that's a conclusion that some people draw from that kind of line of reasoning. And that's why, that explains why, of course, Khuzdul is Semitic. Khuzdul is Semitic because he was already thinking about the Jews. So we start with dwarves and Jews, and then from there we get to the Semitic languages. But that's not how Tolkien thought at all. I am completely convinced that it goes entirely the opposite direction. Again, you read the Hlamas, what's important about Dwarvish languages? He wanted to choose a language which was different, which was unconnected, which is as far separated, philologically speaking, as could be from the other Elvish languages, which are based on Finnish and Welsh, right? This is why he chose a Semitic language, because it's very different linguistically from the others. And I am, Arthur, I am 100% convinced that any overlap between the dwarves and the Jews in Tolkien's mind, or in his depiction of the dwarves, is a result of, it's not the inspiration of, it is a result of the fact that when he maps out the languages, he landed upon Hebrew. He landed upon a Semitic language to serve as kind of the base model. for the linguistic structure of the dwarves' languages. Given that he has them speaking a language which is essentially Semitic, there are sort of Semitic elements or elements associated with that kind of work their way in to the dwarf stories. Anyway, I'm quite convinced that it goes in that way. So so when people talk about that as like, so this reveals Tolkien's, sort of secret thoughts about the Jews, like it's doing it backwards. That's not exactly how it worked. Kate asks, one wonders if Tolkien had known Chinese, would the dwarves have been vaguely Oriental? Possibly. I think that seems to me entirely possible. Yeah, good. Yeah, Lee Smith is pointing to the article "Dwarves Are Not Heroes: Anti-Semitism in the Dwarves" in J.R.R. Tolkien's writing. Brackman in 2010. Yeah, there's stuff out there on this. But again, I always urge the exercise of caution on this, and to not. Richard Albert points out the Tolkien's letter praising Jews, which is, that's of course a very famous letter, the letter that he didn't send, in fact, to the German government. Good. Yeah, Lee points to another one, The Jewish Dwarves, Tolkien and Anti-Semitic Stereotyping, by Vink in 2013 in Tolkien Studies. Yeah, there's lots of stuff out there on this. But anyway, there's definitely a lot of interesting material there. My primary thing about it is just like, be careful. Just be careful, because I think a lot of people leap to conclusions that make me uncomfortable. Just uncomfortable because they don't seem to me to fit the patterns of Tolkien's own thought and creativity very well, or actively misinterpret or miscast some of those things. Good. Stephanie asks, do I think he factored in geography heavily as well, aside from language? Yes and no, Stephanie. I say no because one of the things, and this is something that I've talked about a lot in the recent Mythgard Academy sessions that we've been doing, where we've been looking at the history of the Lord of the Rings, watching the unfolding of the Lord of the Rings story from the earliest manuscripts, the earliest manuscript version of The Unexpected Party, and right now we've just discovered Galadriel for the first time. He just invented the character of Galadriel. We're about halfway through the Treason of Isengard, the book, The Treason of Isengard. And Stephanie, one of the things that I've been suggesting persistently that we can see is Tolkien doesn't invent geography first and have the stories or the characters grow out of the geography. He talks that way. He says that you should make a map first and then base the story on the map, not write a map to fit the story that you've written. Except it's really pretty clear when you read his own manuscript drafting that that's precisely what he did. That he drafts, the stories emerge, and then he shapes the map to fit, and often radically reshapes the map and reconsiders things as the story itself evolves. So in that sense, Stephanie, I would say, in that sense, he doesn't factor in geography. That is to say, I don't think that much of the character or sort of the nature of people or races sort of is very dependent upon geography. There are some senses, though, in which I would say it's true. And this is where, in particular, I come... this is where, on another racial issue, right? The question of, like, why are there no dark-skinned people, or the only dark-skinned people that there are bad guys, right? When we get the Haradrim coming up from the south with their dark skins and red tongues and things like that, and all the good guys are white, right? That's a thing, of course, that a lot of people also, make a lot out of. There, Stephanie, it seems to me that that does have to do with geography, broadly speaking. right? That there's no two ways about the fact that Tolkien's whole world is set in a basically Nordic environment, right? And that's true even in sort of the spirit of it, right? As so much of it is informed by this sort of Germanic, sort of the spirit, the northernness, right? And so, yeah, like the bad guys are located, as he says, in the northwest, of the northwestern portion of the older of the old world. His world is very centered. The whole part of like Eriador and Rovanian, almost all of that is basically like Europe, essentially. And most of it focuses on northern and western Europe. So Marianne, exactly, his world is a northern world. And so, yeah, exactly. We don't get Asians, right? We don't get Chinese people. We don't get dark-skinned people. We don't get, when we do, right, when we do get like more equatorial people who are coming up, because they're coming up from far away from the lands, where the stories of the good guys have been, and they've been dominated by the Dark Lord because they're way down there, so they get brought up and they're bad guys, right? They're strangers from far away, and the color of their skins just shows in this northern place they are strangers from far away. It doesn't mean that like black people are evil, that's and going there I find very strained. Anyway, so I do think that so Stephanie, that's why I say both no and yes. Laura's teasing me for go not to Corey for answers, for he will say both no and yes. But that's how I think. In some sense we can see a very broad influence of geography, and yet I don't think this sort of geographical specifics of where people live has a huge influence on things. Okay, cool. Yeah. Jennifer says geography does affect language, and it seems that Tolkien just worked that backwards, language to geography. Yeah, Jennifer, because what emerges when you look at the Llamas, when you look at his account of tongues, at the end of the day, the Elvish languages, all these things that he's playing with, not just the individual languages, but the relationship among the languages and the development of the languages over time. This is like a philologist's playground. And what you see when you look at the Llamas is it's like a set of case studies, like a set of philological case studies. Every different kind of philological scenario that you can invent, right? So these, what would happen if these people who spoke the same language were separated for a really long time geographically, right? And didn't have any interactions for thousands of years and then came back together. What would they find? Would they still be able to talk to each other? How would their languages have changed? Especially given if we think about the different, sort of like geopolitical situations of those two peoples while they were separated, right? Okay, and what if one splinter group of this one people separated off, and then later on they came and merged with these other people? What would a language which was like the proto-language of this other people, but then combined with an earlier version of this other language because they were living right next to it, what would that look like, right? And so I get this. It's like fun with language and language combinations, and him sort of working through just playing the game, right? Playing the game of first let's make up a base language, and then let's ring the changes, right? Let's see how this works. And that's where the stories come from. That's why there are green elves in Osirian. That's what the green elves are. They're like the splinter group of this one group who then encountered this other group, and it was totally linguistic. As you can see in the Llamas, it all works. So Jennifer, in that sense, geography does affect language. Yes, but Tolkien did it the other way around, right? What he wanted was this to create a particular linguistic situation. So he has to manipulate the geography in order to bring about that linguistic situation. So absolutely, we see that happening. Good. Good point, Mike. Mike Moore says people will look at the Semitic nature of the Dwarves language and sort of move from there to saying that the Dwarves are Jewish, right? And that therefore the way that he's depicting the dwarves are like, that this is like a Jewish thing. And Mike points out, people don't say the same thing about the Welsh, right? Like that elves are Welsh, right? So like there's this like nobody draws quite the same identity between like the Sindar and the Welsh, or between the Noldor and the Finns, right? That's just it's not. People don't think that way, and I think that's a really good sort of thing to remember. But one might say, but hang on, but what about those elements, as Arthur, as you were saying before, you can see, right, some overlap between the depiction of the dwarves and some of these traditional Jewish stereotypes. I bet if you looked, you could find some similar things with the Welsh and some similar things with Finnish, right? Read the Kalevala, and you'll find some ways in which the High Elves of Valinor have some similarities with some things that go on in the Kalevala, right? Think about, the Silmarils and the Sampo from the Kalevala, right? There are some similarities there. But it doesn't have the freight, right, Mike? I mean, that's why people don't get worked up about those kinds of things. But I agree with the point, Mike, that you seem to be making, right? That it's to make sort of a big deal of one of those crossovers while kind of overlooking or sort of sweeping away the others is not to be quite fair, right? Yeah, good. Exactly, Matthew. The Irish and the Dunlendings and the Anglo-Saxons and the Rohirrim. Of course, there is much comment on the Anglo-Saxons and the Rohirrim. One of my favorite lines of what I can't help but think of as one of the most insincere lines or rather like the most kind of feeble protestation that Tolkien ever made is in Appendix F, isn't it? When he talks about the Rohirrim and the Anglo-Saxons, and he's like, they're totally not Anglo-Saxons. Like, there's nothing to see here, right? There's just don't think about the Rohirrim as Anglo-Saxons, because they're totally not. Really, I mean, there's almost no similarities, right? I just absolutely love that moment there. Good. Anyway, okay. So there's a lot that we could do there. And Matthew, Matt, I do like the point about the Irish and the Dunlendings. Matt, didn't you just publish an article on that? Didn't you just publish an article on the word Forgoil, which is like the only Dunlendish word that we get in the Lord of the Rings, and on Forgoil and the Irish, right? And isn't that in the most recent volume of Tolkien studies, as I'm recalling? Yeah, exactly. That's really cool. So I recommend that to everybody. Matthew DeForest article on Forgoil and the Irish, and looking at that connection. Yeah. And Laura Burkholz, you're absolutely right. Laura's thinking about the dwarves, right? And their attachment to money and to gold and to valuable things. And of course, Laura points out that dwarves already were like that, right? I mean, so when dwarves are obsessed about gold and money, are they being like Shylock the Jew, or are they being like the Norse dwarves, right? Remember, it was the golden hoard of a dwarf, which leads to the curse of Fafnir, right? The Fafnir, the dragon, in Old Norse, becomes a dragon through his dragon sickness, right? Through his desire for the wealth of a dwarf, right? So Laura, you're absolutely right. Again, this is where this is why I always want to pump the brakes really hard when we start talking about dwarves and Jews, because again, you can run with it, you can make it work. But it's not that simple, and I don't think it works quite in that same way. Okay, I should I should probably let everybody go. It's been a long day, but I did want to end by, first of all, thanking everybody. This is the first day of our fundraising campaign. We've officially launched our 2017 fundraising campaign today. We've received several very generous donations already. Many thanks to those of you who have already given. I want to encourage everybody, of course, if you enjoy what we do here, opportunities to sit around and talk like this. I've been doing a lot of reflecting on this. It's for me, one of the fun things about the fundraising campaign is it's sort of a wonderful moment for me to kind of sit back and, sort of look back at, Signum University and the Mythgard Institute, who we are, what we do, what we've been doing, where we're going, the occasion that the fundraising campaign gives to really communicate that, to kind of put that into words and explain that to people who aren't, connected to it day by day the way that I am, is always really, really, really fun and really rewarding for me. So anyway, I'm looking forward to kind of sharing some of that with everybody over the next few weeks as we're going through our fundraising campaign. But yeah, so I mean, if this is the kind of thing, these kinds of opportunities to come together. Think about the not only the fun that we're able to have and the way that we can kind of learn together as we read and discuss these things together, but even the way I think there is definitely material for spin-off of several interesting scholarly articles, I think, from some of the things that we touched on here tonight. I would love to see a fuller treatment of that Odysseus thing, especially. But anyway, so yeah, I've been loving that. If you have appreciated the opportunity, I hope you'll consider supporting Signum in our fundraising campaign here. You can find our donation page at signumuniversity.org/donate, and I encourage you. I hope that you'll be able to consider supporting us and enabling us to continue this work for another year and beyond. So thanks everybody for joining me today. Happy Hobbit Day. Thanks for sharing this moment with me. Really fun to kind of have such an sort of planned and a completely spontaneous. I have no slides to cover, right? So I have having no goals and just being able to have an open chat with you guys. Always fun to be able to get together like this. So thanks everybody for this opportunity, and I look forward to more great times together. Lots of really good things coming up this coming week. We're going to be talking a lot about the fundraiser, doing some. If you attend some of our regular sessions, especially some of the regular Mythgard sessions that I do, exploring the Lord of the Rings on Tuesday, the Mythgard Academy, Treason of Isengard on Wednesday night, my Lord of the Rings online streams. We're going to be doing some really fun prizes and giveaways and things like that. It's always a fun moment to kind of celebrate with everybody and just kind of sit back and appreciate the fun that we're able to have here in doing these things together. So we're going to be doing a bunch of that this coming week and in the weeks to come. Anyway, so I hope you'll be able to join me for some of that, and I look forward to more fun conversations here in the next few weeks. So don't forget, signumuniversity.org/donate. I hope you'll take the opportunity to support Signum and help us keep going. Thanks very much, everybody, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye now.